what I would like to do is to talk about the crisis of neoliberalism and the rise of authoritarianism today. I think it is one of the most important topics in the political economy of neoliberalism today. And I would like to explain a bit about the way I see it, but also I want to have time to hear from you how you see it and how the experiences that I have had and that have shaped my thinking on this compare to your experiences. And then we would have a very nice conversation. Well, my starting point is the fact that we do live in very interesting times, very disturbing times as well. And the election of Donald Trump serves as a reminder that we live in times that only a few years ago would have been unimaginable. And these are also times of farcical mishandling of politics. But Trump is a big example. Trump is not the only example of the politics of the extreme. We know that authoritarian governments have taken power in a wide variety of countries. Recently, certainly my own country of Brazil, but also clearly in India as well, and then a whole range of countries elsewhere. This happens in the age of neoliberalism, and this has to be the starting point, I think, for any reflection about what is driving the politics of our age. Neoliberalism, I understand it as the current phase or configuration or mode of existence of capitalism, a system of accumulation that emerged after the crisis of Keynesianism in the advanced countries, the crisis of developmentalism across the developing countries, the crisis of Soviet-style socialism. Neoliberalism then spread throughout the world in different phases, following different paths, but it now virtually dominates the world. And it dominates the world with a driver, with a single driver in different paths, in different ways, but with a single driver, that is financialization. Financialization, to me, is the most significant, is the defining feature of neoliberalism. Financialization has been understood in many different ways. The way I understand it is the dominance, the subordination of social reproduction and economic reproduction by the intensive and extensive accumulation of what Marx called interest-bearing capital. So interest-bearing capital dominating every sphere of life and every aspect of social life today. Now, financialization and neoliberalism, understood as this complex that defines the current phase of capitalism, they have been responsible, they have driven the most remarkable recovery of profitability in recent times. Certainly a very strong recovery of profits around the world and in the advanced economies in particular since the 1980s. And at the same time as profitability was rising, finance, the broad financial system, the broad financial industry was being able to capture an increasing share of the total value produced in the economy. The typical example in this context is the United States, where the total profits of financial companies, understood as the finance, insurance, real estate sector, their profits increased from a little over 10% of total profits, just in the post-Second World War period, to a peak of 41% of total profits in 2002. 41% of all profits in the US being captured by finance at that point in time, at the beginning of the new millennium. This share declined enormously after the global financial crisis in 2009, but almost immediately it recovered, and it's now in the region of 20 to 30% of all profits being captured by finance. Now, We know, again, from Marxist political economy that finance does not produce value. Finance transfers value from and captures value produced in other parts of the economy. So this process has been responsible also for a large part of the dynamics of profitability in the economy as a whole, as I'll come back to in a moment. But this has had very substantial distributional implications as well. So financialization and neoliberalism drive the recovery of profits. They also drive rising inequality around the world. Now, at the same time as this is happening, financialization and neoliberalism have been responsible for a tremendous redistribution and rejigging of economic dynamics at a global level, which in normal conventional discourse is called globalization. It's an imprecise term, but it's good enough for us this morning. Countries, particularly in Northeast and Southeast Asia, have been able to gain enormously in terms of economic rates of growth. They are the new poles of accumulation around the world. China, in particular, has become the assembly hub for the entire global economy, and that is an extremely important feature of the world in which we live. But this is not to say that neoliberalism has led to a global convergence. And a few years ago, it was common to talk about the rise of the South and global convergence. This is incorrect. What neoliberalism and financialization have done primarily, from my point of view, is to create new patterns of uneven and combined development and new patterns of inequality around the world. In particular, we can spend a whole day discussing this, but the most important aspect of this is the juxtaposition of enormous prosperity in certain sections of the global economy in some countries, but particularly in some sections of the population that we regularly call the elites or the oligarchs or the top 1% or the top 0.01%, gaining enormously from neoliberalism everywhere, and the creation of new patterns of poverty around the world and the reproduction of poverty where poverty already existed before. Financialization has also created a tendency towards short-termism in production and a tendency towards speculation in economic activity, and that sometimes confronts and contradicts long-term investment for productivity growth, which was one of the features of developmentalism and Keynesianism in the previous period. The consequence is that under neoliberalism and under financialization, the process of accumulation has taken particular features, and the most significant feature is that it is based on bubbles. Bubbles that are grounded on the restructuring of production, the restructuring of production at the global level, the restructuring of production at the national level, based on the expansion of precarious labor, increasingly precarious forms of labor that now lead to this gig economy that we have today of extremely flexible workers that are at the beck and call of capital in different sectors and different countries. So this is restructuring. It's also based, it's a global economy based on extractions. Extraction of value from the periphery through unequal trade, through financial transactions, through rents, and so on. And it's an economy evidently, and unfortunately, I haven't got time for this today, but it's an economy that is parasitical on the plunder of nature. A plunder that is so extreme that threatens the survival of the human species and of life in the planet itself. Now, financialization then has been connected to these changes in forms of accumulation. It has also been associated with falling rates of investment, tendentially in most countries, falling rates of investment, falling rates of GDP growth, and increasing volatility and instability in the economy and in society as well. This is true, and it holds at a global level, it holds in most countries. And this is the first thing that I want to call your attention to. This happens even though neoliberalism has imposed the most favorable conditions for accumulation in the history of capitalism. It is extraordinary. The West won the Cold War. Most nationalist movements and most developmental governments in the global South have collapsed. Trade, finance, and capital movements have been liberalized everywhere. States, competing states everywhere, offer enormous support for all forms of capital accumulation. Taxation has declined in many countries, most typically, very recently in the United States under the Trump administration. Transfers and welfare provision, particularly in the advanced economies, have been contained, if not reversed. Most traditional forms of resistance, the trade unions, political parties of the left, peasant movements, social movements, etc., they have declined or disappeared altogether. And at the ideological level is this tremendous dominance, the hegemony of neoliberalism. Give capital all that they want. Everything that they want, they've got. And what do we have? We have the most unstable economy in recent decades. We have tremendous volatility at the global level. We have declining rates of GDP growth across the advanced economies and in most developing countries too. In this case, India stands as an exception, and China stands out as the biggest exception, but almost everywhere else, capitalism is losing dynamism. So you give capital everything it wants, and it, instead of thriving, it splutters. It doesn't know what to do with it. We have, since 2007, the longest and the deepest economic crisis since 1929, the weakest recovery on record, the most regressive, distributionally, the most regressive economic recovery on record as well. So this to me is a paradox. And I call this the economic paradox of neoliberalism. You achieve the most extraordinarily favorable conditions for accumulation, and you can't capitalize on them. What's wrong with neoliberalism? That to me is a paradox, and I want to explore this issue with you today. Now, let me shift slightly in focus and look at history. And neoliberalism has been through three periods that are very roughly divided by the early 1990s and then by the global crisis. The first period historically for neoliberalism is the period or the phase of transition, the shock phase, in which you have the aggressive promotion of private capital with very little regard for the consequences. It's a period of movement from whatever existed before, Soviet-style socialism, import-substituting industrialization, Keynesianism, social democracy, whatever, into neoliberalism. And it's a phase driven by force to contain labor, to disorganize labor, to promote the internationalization of domestic capital with transnational capital and transnational finance. And it's a moment where you put in place the new institutional framework on which neoliberalism depends in order to thrive. And you can look historically at the examples, first of all, the military dictatorships in Uruguay, in Chile, and in Argentina in the 1970s, neoliberalism before neoliberalism itself. Then this is followed by Thatcherism, by Reaganism, and by their imitators and offspring in the advanced economies. Then you have a wave of structural adjustment in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1980s. Then you have the transitions to capitalism in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. You have the East Asian crisis in the late 1990s. You have India coming in during this period as well. That's the first phase. Transitions happening at different moments in time, but with a very similar dynamics, all of them. The second phase of neoliberalism is a mature phase, is a third wayist phase where neoliberalism rebalances itself and addresses the dysfunctions and the terrible social consequences of the first phase, of the transition phase. And then during that period, you have the consolidation of the hegemony of finance in economic reproduction and social reproduction. You have the management of the new modalities of international integration, and you have the rollout, very interestingly, the rollout of new social policies that are typically neoliberal, conditional cash transfers being the most evident example of that. The rollout of new social policies to manage the patterns of poverty that were created by neoliberalism as societies moved to them. Okay. Conditional cash transfers, very briefly, as payments that are made to usually very, very poor families, very tiny payments in exchange for particular forms of behavior, payments that are often made to women, usually to mothers, in exchange for sending their children to school, in exchange for doing particular measures of healthcare, in exchange for providing labor, different patterns around the world. That is, again, typical neoliberalism in the social domain. We move to a third phase of neoliberalism after the global financial crisis, a new phase that is that draws on the loss of legitimacy that came from the realization around the world of the astronomical costs of financialization and the gigantic flaws of financialization. Again, give capital all that it wants, give finance all that it wants, and the consequence is the biggest crisis on record. At the same time, the perception that neoliberalism led to the concentration of income and wealth, and that, if you remember, the book Capital by Thomas Piketty, that captured the imagination. It's an almost unreadable book. It has all sorts of problems, but it captured the imagination. You look around in any bookshop, they had mountains of that book. It has sold millions of copies, even though most people don't read it. But it did capture the spirit of the moment, the realization that neoliberalism meant greater inequality, and this was wrong. For some reason it was wrong, and people were looking for an explanation for that. Also the realization that neoliberalism imposed very unpopular patterns of employment and very unpopular ways of social reproduction. And the perception that even though they had everything, all the favorable conditions for capital growth, it didn't deliver that. So why is it? And following from that, the loss of legitimacy. And the consequence has been the enforcement of an increasingly repressive form of neoliberalism in order to maintain the pattern of accumulation when it was in crisis and had lost legitimacy, partly because of that, leading to authoritarian forms of government, which is what I want to talk to you about now, as a condition for sustaining the pattern of accumulation and validating these authoritarian modes of government by recourse to forms of nationalism and forms of racism as well. And that is the characteristic of neoliberalism at this moment in time. The universal perception that neoliberalism is not able to realize any form of shared prosperity, but that it will continue to exist. And in order to do so, it will deploy force. So after the global crisis, going back 10 years ago, the profitability of finance was restored through the policies that were adopted by one government after another to support the financial system, to subsidize the financial institutions, to guarantee rates of return for capital. But they absolutely did not address the causes of the disaster. And these causes of the disaster have created, and the policies that followed from the disaster, they have created new vulnerabilities in the global economy. So you impose zero interest rates, rescue policies, quantitative easing, all things that were supposed to reduce systemic financial risks. And what you have is the creation of gigantic speculative bubbles, particularly in the global south. Between the beginning of the crisis and 2015, the total debt of the financial corporations around the world increased by $12 trillion, public sector debt increased by $25 trillion, and the debts of households increased by $7 trillion. And it's not just the adverse distributional consequences of the crisis. This is not just at the level of debt and finance. in the United States between 2009 and 2013, all the income growth that took place in the recovery from the crisis, all of it, went to the top 10% of families, and the income of the bottom 90% of families actually fell. So for them, the crisis has not finished at all. And this is a significant part of the picture of global neoliberalism. Everyone realizes that. Even the International Monetary Fund now accepts that neoliberalism has been associated with a deterioration of distribution of income around the world, and something has to be done about this in order to stabilize accumulation and to restore legitimacy to the system as well. But so far, not much has been done. But the consequence is, observably, if you let neoliberalism have its way, what you end up with is a society of tremendous wealth and a society of shantytowns at the same time. And this is very difficult to justify in the world of today. Now, if you look at neoliberalism in political terms, then we have a different story still. If you remember, the rollout of neoliberalism in the phase of transition, that takes place in different ways and at different points in time in different parts of the world. And it politically has different forms as well. Neoliberalism rolls out by constitutional means in most advanced countries. Neoliberalism is imposed by terrorist dictatorships in many Latin American countries and in many sub-Saharan African countries. Neoliberalism comes together with transitions to democracy in Brazil, in South Africa, in South Korea, across Eastern Europe. But whatever the path of transition, by the 1990s, there was in the world kind of a typical political form of neoliberalism, and that political form was a particular kind of democracy, a neoliberal democracy. A neoliberal democracy that was not an abstract democracy, and it was different from the political democracies that existed in the advanced countries, for example, after the Second World War, if you want to look back, different from the democracies that existed before the First World War. A neoliberal democracy that is limited. Neoliberal democracy that is circumscribed because in this typical political regime for neoliberalism, you have an institutional apparatus in place that is set up in order to insulate economic policy decisions from the possibility of interference by the majority of the population. So the decisions about social provision, about the composition of output, about the structure of employment, about the distribution of income, they're all taken out of the political domain. They are moved into what is presented as technical, neutral institutions, ministries of finance, but they are dominated by neoliberal policymakers. Independent central banks that are completely captured by finance, that are mandated to deliver inflation targets, and of course, if necessary, they must rescue financial institutions. You have treasury departments, but those treasury departments are constrained by fiscal deficit rules, unless, of course, they have to fund unlimited levels of support for the financial system. Again, you have floating exchange rate regimes that constrain governments to follow the desires of the financial markets. Otherwise, you have a balance of payments crisis, the exchange rate collapses. You have the privatization of utility companies that are then bought up by transnational banks and hedge funds, and then you lose control over important areas of social provision. You have regulatory agencies to look after the privatized sectors, but they are captured by the conglomerates that supposedly they are there to control. So institutionally, neoliberalism is locked in one area of the economy after another. And what you have is the shrinkage of the political space available even to the institutions of nominally democratic states. And as this happens, you have the contraction of the political space for legitimate opposition as well. In country after country, the pattern that we see is that normal politics became a very narrow thing that was essentially bound by the competition between slightly different shades of neoliberalism in a very circumscribed political market policed by the judicial system and by the media. Very heavily constrained, very narrow terms of debate set up. The implication is that in neoliberal societies, even in democracies, states and societies and political systems lose the capacity to decide policy and to shape policy within their own borders, and the political system loses increasingly the ability to find negotiated solutions to national problems. And that was considered to be by neoliberalism a good thing. In reality, it took away the legitimacy and the flexibility of domestic politics, and that is a problem. Now, the second limitation of neoliberal democracy is that it has been taking place under circumstances of heavy economic restructuring, and particularly the internationalization of systems of production, internationalization of labor processes, of technologies, of inputs, of outputs, with very serious implications for patterns of international specialization in economies, patterns of employment, patterns of consumption around the world, and then changing forms of social reproduction and forms of community life almost everywhere. And the consequence of this has been the creation of one of the key social consequences of this, and I want to focus on this now just because we have limited time. One of the consequences of this has been the creation of an enormous array of economic losers around the world. These are people, tens of millions of people, whose jobs have been eliminated, particularly visible in the advanced economies, but you can see them in developing countries as well. Entire professions have vanished, or they were exported to cheaper countries. Employment opportunities in the public sector have declined because of privatizations, because of the retrenching of the state. Job stability has declined everywhere. Pay and conditions have deteriorated. The informal workers have very limited avenues to move into formal jobs. And the workers who were in the formal sector have grown to become very fearful of the elimination or the export of their jobs, and they have to bear having to bear increasing stresses because of overwork in precarious jobs, even in formal workplaces. Now, from the point of view of the working class, this has been very, very strong, a very strong adverse pressure. Even for the middle classes around the world, they have become increasingly indebted and impoverished and anxious and vulnerable. That's again a vulnerability that neoliberalism has created, and that has political implications. And my third limitation of neoliberal democracy is that the economic and political and ideological and institutional hegemony of neoliberalism has been accompanied by a tremendous narrowing of the capacity and the ambition and the scope for collective action. And that because of, I think, two converging processes. One I mentioned before is the loss of sources of inspiration for policy alternatives. All the alternatives that we thought existed, they are gone. So what is out there to inspire people to do something, to fight for something different? And at the same time, you have this tremendous escalation of the policing of dissent through individual privacy and civil liberties and collective actions, particularly being felt after 9/11, but around the world very strongly as well. You have then a process of evacuation of neoliberal democracy, a process that is seen by those losers from neoliberalism that I described before. Interestingly, it tends to be seen through the lens of corruption. The corruption of elites, very poorly specified elites, corruption grounded on undue privilege of the rich, and corruption grounded on excessive servicing provided to the undeserving poor, to foreigners, to minorities, to foreign countries. It's the other. We had something, we don't have it anymore. We had jobs, we had security, we had income, we had pensions or the promise of pensions. We've lost that. Who took it? They took it up there, they took it down here, they took it outside. It's been taken from us. So those groups are incorrectly taken to be favored by public policy, the poor, the rich, the foreigners, and then the state institutions themselves are presented as being hostile. And this is again very, very clear in the advanced economies. The state institutions are very hostile to the losers, who are morally upright, good people who have inexplicably found themselves in difficult financial straits, and this is wrong and it is unfair. Why is this happening to us? Everything seems to be, from their point of view, upside down, and then you look back into the distant past, misty olden days when people of good character, strong discipline, people sharing our values in the West, males with the correct ethnic background, they could count on steady employment, rising incomes, they could have promotion prospects, pensions, all that. And this leads to a political paradox that I'll mention in a moment. What you find then is that in neoliberalism today, the losers are increasingly driven to frame their disappointments, their resentments, their fears, their hopes through the prism of an ethical conflict between insiders and outsiders in a universe, remember the left has been destroyed by now, in a universe where there is no exploitation. Exploitation is just not present. So it has to be an ethical conflict. It is not an economic conflict. What you find is that members of our group are surrounded by predatory non-members. And these predatory non-members, by definition, they are dishonest. We are honest, we are good. They are dishonest, they are stealing from us. This is very, very clear in the Trump discourse, my example number one, but then across the board in authoritarian discourse around the world as well. So you have politicians stealing our money, immigrants taking our jobs, taking our houses, taking our hospitals. You have distant countries taking our jobs as well. These are tendencies of exclusion. And these tendencies have been intensified by the fiscal austerity that followed from the global financial crisis and by the consequences of low economic growth around the world. So the political paradox of neoliberalism that I want to suggest to you is the disintegration of neoliberal democracy because of those contradictions. Neoliberal democracy evacuated the political capacities of the state, reduced the space for negotiation and for collective initiative, and led to the creation of a political order that is now losing its legitimacy very rapidly in connection to the ideological crisis of neoliberalism. And the consequence, and again stressing, because we do not have a mass left anymore, the consequence has been that discontent has been dominated by the far right. The far right occupied this political space, and the far right, not the far right in general, but it's a far right that is polarized by authoritarian leaders, nationalist leaders, that promise to confront the neoliberal state, promise to confront finance, promise to confront globalization, promise to confront the elites and the foreigners, and so on, gain the support of the losers with this platform, and when they get to power, what do? They do exactly the opposite. They implement policies that lead to the intensification of neoliberalism, justified by this nationalist discourse and a more or less explicit racism, depending on the country that we may be focusing on. So, my suggestion is that the rise of this form of authoritarian neoliberalism is not a transitory blip. This is not the politics of the global economic crisis. A politics that will fail and then lead back to the restoration of normal or centrist or third wayist evacuated neoliberal politics. It's not that Donald Trump will lose the next election. He may or may not lose, I don't care. No, that's not the point. That Donald Trump will lose the next election and this will lead back to the Clinton and moderate Republicans political dynamics in the United States and similar processes in other parts of the world. This is not that. What is happening is also not a marker of the end of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is now going to realize that it has failed and then lead to a different form of politics. No. What we have now is the rise of a particular kind of politics, the politics of our day and age, a politics of decomposed neoliberal democracy, a politics that comes out of the crises of restructured economies and political systems and institutions of representation under neoliberalism, all of them in crisis too, and a politics that is characterized by the capture, the hijacking of mass discontent by the far right. And the implication is the opposition between the insiders and outsiders, where politics is characterized by cheating and by the restoration, the attempt to restore our national intrinsic virtues as well. It's a way to build collectivity in circumstances where collectivity has been erased by neoliberalism in the previous phase. And one of its features is this rise of supposedly strong leaders who pretend to be able to talk honestly and to represent the people and to get things done by force of will, usually validated by their own CV with supposed achievements at the level of business. I'm a successful businessman, therefore I can be a good politician, trust me. This is not really the formation of a mass social movement, but it is the projection of power into controlled structures are built around those political figures. And who are these figures? This is not fascism of the 1930s, not at all. These are political leaders that made their way to power by means of ploys, very clever ploys, by means of expensive advertising, by means of planned agitation, by means of force, brute force as well, in order to enforce a radically neoliberal program grounded on conservative politics and steamrolling the opposition at the same time. Interestingly, to their right stand even more dangerous movements that claim to represent the losers in even more extreme, in even more aggressive ways. So the paradox of authoritarian neoliberalism is that it leads to the personalization of politics through this emergence of spectacular leaders that are not limited by intermediary institutions, party political structures or trade unions or social movements or the law. They have a lot more flexibility in terms of their exercise of powers. They are heavily committed to neoliberalism and to their own personal power as well. But they implement, when they are in power, they implement political programs and economic projects that harm their own social base. And that to me is very, very significant. They will, once in power, do things that harm their own voters. They promote a radical version of neoliberalism and they attack all forms of opposition. They promote financialization even when they're talking against it. Society is divided even more. Taxes become even more regressive. Social protections are rolled back. Economies become more unbalanced. Poverty tends to grow. The consequence is the growth of mass frustration leading to an even more unfocused discontent. This is a more divided society than it was before. My conclusion from this is that authoritarian neoliberalism is intrinsically unstable. This is not a form of politics that can last for very long. And it leads to even greater prominence to the far right. Authoritarian neoliberalism corrodes the politics of neoliberalism from within, with the possibility that modern forms of fascism will grow at the margins and then take over this center ground as well. Let me wrap up. I've talked too much. Neoliberalism to me is trapped today by three paradoxes. It's trapped by an economic paradox, that it has created and imposed the most favorable conditions for accumulation, but it's unable to realize them, and economies stagnate. It's trapped by a political paradox where you consolidate a neoliberal democracy again as you wished. Take out the economy from political decisions, build up those rigid institutions to implement your policy, the policy that you chose, what do you get? You get the loss of political legitimacy, and then you have the rise of anti-systemic forces dominated by spectacular leaders, with the political spectrum shifting increasingly to the right. And you have the paradox, my third paradox, the paradox of authoritarian neoliberalism, where you have this emergence of spectacular political leaders committed to neoliberalism and committed to their own power. They attack the opposition, they implement radicalized neoliberalism, they harm their own base of support, and they undermine the conditions for this form of politics itself. So this is not a form of politics that can deliver stability. It is a form of politics that is likely to lead to new forms of fascism and confrontation on the part of the far right. One final word, then I will stop. At the same time that I think that the dominant trends in politics in our times are reactionary trends leading to greater authoritarianism, we also have been able to see, particularly in the United States and in the UK, the emergence of new forces of the left. The movement around Bernie Sanders, the movement around Jeremy Corbyn. And they show, after many years of successive defeats, possibilities for victory, possibilities for the build-up of mass movements of the left. This is a time then, not of unmitigated disaster for the left, but a time of re-emergence of social movements, a time of, after 30 or 40 years of unmitigated defeat, a time of creativity and of possibilities for the left as well. We are definitely, clearly on the defensive, but we do have possibilities, and we have to see how we can build on them and explore them, leading to this emergence of a new generation of mass movements of the left, confronting exclusion, nationalism, racism with new forms of collectivity, which is the characteristic of the left. The build-up of unity and collectivity on our side versus the destructive powers of the right. So, thanks very much.